On the night when the palace clock struck the third watch, a cry rang out from the Empress's chambers, dry, hollow, as if squeezed from her throat. The servants standing guard outside the door did not dare to enter. For several weeks, a pungent smell had lingered in these rooms, mixed with the iron smell of blood and the sweetish stench of rotting flesh. Only the personal physician, trembling, crossed the threshold. On the bed, among tangled sheets, lay a woman whose face had lost half its human features. The skin on her cheeks had peeled away, leaving dark patches. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her eyes were filled with a cloudy gleam. Next to her, on a table, stood a silver cup with a thick, grayish suspension, the medicine that, at the Empress's behest, was given to her 3 times a day. Inside was crushed cinnabar mixed with wine, mercury prescribed to expel black bile and purify the blood. Her illness began imperceptibly in late autumn, with a slight tremor in her hands and paleness, which the courtiers attributed to fatigue. Doctors prescribed her juniper infusions and powders made from crushed minerals, assuring her that such remedies would strengthen her spirit and protect her from rotten decay, as they called the internal decomposition of the body. The Empress believed in the power of metals, believing that the body could be remelted and renewed. The first doses of mercury only caused drowsiness, but by the end of winter, her hair began to fall out in clumps. Her gums swelled and began to bleed, and her breath acquired a persistent smell of metal and rot. Servants noticed how she would jump out of bed at night, clutching her throat as if she was suffocating, and whispering incoherent words, sometimes calling out the names of long-dead relatives. With each passing day, her speech became more and more indistinct, and her movements became sharp and uncontrollable. The doctors explained this as evaporations from the disease, and continued to give her increasingly concentrated doses. One of the young doctors who had arrived from the provinces wrote in a report to his mentor, "I saw how the skin on her forearms turned grey-blue as if frostbitten, and dark stripes appeared underneath, like veins of rotten wood. Her fingers can no longer bend, and her joints are stiff and painful to the touch." Access to her chambers was strictly limited. By order of the head of the palace guard, only 2 court ladies and 3 servants were allowed to see the Empress, and they were thoroughly searched before entering. All conversations were whispered so as not to disturb the sick woman. Rumors circulated that the restrictions were not really for her peace of mind, but to hide the true condition of the Empress from the nobility and ambassadors. During those same weeks, secret meetings began in the palace corridors between the heirs and their associates, discussing who would take power if the Empress died suddenly. Her cousin, supported by supporters of the old nobility, claimed that her illness was a punishment from heaven for her alliances with reformers, and that power should return to the faithful servants of the ancient laws. Meanwhile, supporters of the Empress's son, who was still a teenager, were preparing their own plan to retain the throne, including negotiations with influential military commanders. The notes of a chambermaid, found later, contain the following lines. "Today, while changing her clothes, I saw that the skin on her feet was cracked, and black crusts had formed in the cracks, giving off an unbearable stench. With every movement, she moaned softly, but did not allow the procedure to be stopped. She ordered her feet to be rubbed with a warm ointment containing crushed lead. They say this should draw the disease out through the skin. After such rubbing, the cracks only deepened, and the tissue around them turned black. The doctors explained this as a sign of purification, although they themselves averted their eyes. By the beginning of spring, the Empress began to have convulsions. Sometimes her body bent so much that it seemed as if her spine would break. During the attacks, 2 servants held her, and the doctor poured a thick opium tincture into her mouth to ease the pain and make her fall asleep. After such potions, she lay motionless, but her breathing became heavy and wheezy. There were increasing whispers in the palace that death was near and that a decision on the regency must be made quickly. However, no one dared to speak openly about this while the Empress was still alive. By the end of the 42nd day of her illness, she stopped getting out of bed. Her body was swollen, especially her face and stomach, and the skin on her hands and neck had darkened. The doctors began to argue among themselves whether to continue the Mercury treatment. The senior physician declared that discontinuing treatment would give rise to accusations of treason and witchcraft if the Empress died. Therefore, the doses were increased on the grounds that poison, if given in time, can become a medicine. During the same period, in a neighboring hall behind heavy doors, trusted advisors and guards gathered. There, for the first time, the question was raised as to who would announce the death and how in order to avoid unrest. But while the Empress was still alive, her suffering was hidden behind a veil of silence and locked doors. By the morning of the 6th week of her illness, it became clear that the Empress was no longer able to speak coherently. Her lips moved constantly, but only a few sounds escaped from her mouth, muffled and hoarse, as if she were drowning in her own saliva. Her eyes wandered, sometimes lingering on an empty corner of the room where, according to her whispers, black figures in crowns stood. The chambermaids who changed the bandages on her hands said that the skin was peeling off in layers, leaving behind wet, oozing tissue that gave off a foul odor. The doctors continued their daily bloodletting, assuring her that excess hot blood was hindering her recovery. A dark, almost black, thickened substance flowed from her thin veins, after which the Empress began to shiver. On days when she felt worse, incense burners filled with smoke from wormwood and juniper were brought into the room to drive out the evil spirit of the disease. However, the smoke made it difficult to breathe, and the Empress began to cough so violently that clots of blood appeared in her phlegm. The guards were reinforced in the corridors around the chambers. Any attempt by servants to pass letters or rumors about the Empress's condition was punished by expulsion or flogging. One of the guards, questioned later, said, "We were ordered not to let anyone in, even if they were close princes or relatives. They said the disease was contagious, but we knew it wasn't about infection." In reality, an open but silent struggle for power was going on in the palace. The Empress's advisors were arguing about the succession. Some wanted to immediately recognize her son as ruler, while others were stalling for time to put forward their own candidates. Meanwhile, in the bedroom itself, the human body was slowly being destroyed. The Empress's nails became brittle and fell off, and deep cracks appeared on her tongue. The food served to her remained untouched. She could only swallow liquid broth or wine with crushed potions. Traces of blood and pus from sores on the back of her head and neck, caused by her immobility, were found on the pillows. The treasurer's reports contained descriptions of how large sums had to be spent on incense, expensive fabrics, and candles to at least slightly mask the stench in her chambers. But even that did not help. The stench seeped into the corridor, and the guards tried to stand duty with their backs turned away from the door. By the middle of the 7th week, the Empress had fallen into a state that doctors called semi-conscious. She could lie for hours with her eyes open, unresponsive to anyone talking to her. Only occasionally did she have fits of intense fear. She screamed that someone was trying to strangle her, snatched spoons with decoctions from the doctor's hands, and demanded that they bring her an icon of the Savior. One of the priests allowed to hear her confession wrote in his notes, "She was shaking like a leaf and kept asking if the Lord would forgive her for the secret deeds that only the palace walls knew about. When I asked her to name them, she covered her face with her hands and said she didn't have the strength." During those same days, in remote parts of the palace, the military joined the secret negotiations. The commander of the guard already had orders to immediately lock the city gates and take control of the treasury in the event of her death. Outwardly, everything remained quiet. But inside the palace, everyone knew that the days of the ruler were numbered. The doctors, to justify their powerlessness, began to say that the illness was God's judgment, and that the only thing that could be done was to ease her suffering with opium and rub ointments made of sulfur and lead into her skin. These procedures only caused new burns and ulcers. One night, a chambermaid noticed that the skin on the Empress's stomach had become so thin that blue veins were visible, and beneath them were dark spots that looked like internal bruises. Her breathing became labored, and her lips turned blue. But even in this condition, she continued to be given mercury powder, assured that it was too late to retreat. In reports later found in the archives, one of the courtiers wrote, "The Empress is hardly human, but an empty shell. She lives by the power of fear, hers and ours. As long as she breathes, no one dares to declare her dead, even if her eyes are already lifeless." By the morning of the 8th week, the disease had reached its peak. The Empress could no longer move on her own. Her arms and legs were convulsed, her joints were swollen, the skin on her shins was cracked, and a murky liquid oozed from the cracks. Her lips were covered with crusts of blood, and her gums were so rotten that her teeth were loose and fell out when she coughed. Her eyes were half closed, and her pupils reacted sluggishly to light. The doctors, although they understood that the end was near, continued the ritual of giving her wine, mixed with crushed cinnabar to complete the treatment. The room was filled with a heavy, sticky smell mixed with the smoke of resin, which was burned to ward off the spirit of death. The servants tried to change her bedding, but within an hour the sheets were damp with sweat, pus, and blood stains. They touched her body only with gloves to prevent infection, although many knew that mercury poisoning was not contagious. In her final days, she began to suffer from such severe delirium that the guards, on the orders of the chamberlain, kept 2 armed men at her door. She screamed that they were trying to poison her and demanded to see her son, but the guards did not let the air in. The advisors feared that the young man would use the meeting to proclaim himself ruler while his mother was still alive. During one of these fits, she tore the cross she had worn since her youth from her neck and threw it into a corner, screaming that God had abandoned her. The only witness to this was a priest who was ordered to remain silent. On the night of the 3rd day of the spring festival, what would later be called the final seizure began. Her body arched, foam mixed with blood came out of her mouth, and her eyes rolled back. The doctors poured strong opium tincture down her throat, but her breathing became increasingly rare. Her last breaths were accompanied by a wheezing sound similar to a moan. Witnesses claimed that by this point, her face had lost all human features. Her skin had turned marble white, her lips were blue, and a dark liquid was flowing from her nose and mouth. Death came before dawn. The body was immediately wrapped in a cloth soaked in herbal decoction and, on the orders of the head of the guard, carried out through a side door to avoid rumors. The embalmers worked quickly. Due to swelling and decomposition, the internal organs began to secrete a foul-smelling liquid that soaked the floor. They filled the cavities with a mixture of salt, crushed chalk, and herbs, but the smell could only be partially suppressed. At this time, a series of quick decisions began in the palace. The Council of Elders announced the death only 2 days later, explaining the delay by the need to observe the rites. By this time, the guard had already occupied the treasury, and the keys to the secret vaults had been handed over to the heir's supporters. The cousin, upon learning of the death, attempted to gather his supporters but was arrested and placed under house arrest. The first rumors in the city were contradictory. Some said that the Empress had been killed, others that she had died of an incurable disease. Priests in their sermons called her departure the will of heaven, but quietly discussed among themselves that the metal that heals can kill. The people, however, greeted her death with cold caution. Some mourned, others hoped that with her departure, taxes and heavy duties would cease. That morning, when the coffin with the Empress's body was carried in a closed coffin to the temple, negotiations for new alliances were already underway outside the palace windows. Power had changed hands, but the poison that had been dripping into her cup for so many weeks remained a symbol of her reign, a mixture of fear, belief in false medicines, and the struggle for the throne. After the Empress's death, the palace was turned into a fortress for several days. The guards did not let anyone out without written permission, and double guards stood at all the city gates. Rumors that she had died of poisoning were countered by announcing that the Empress had humble. However, those who saw her body in her final hours knew the truth. Dark spots on her skin and destroyed tissue left no doubt that mercury poison had been used. The funeral took place without an open farewell. The coffin was not even opened in front of her closest relatives. Priests read funeral services in semi-darkness, and so much incense was burned in the temple that the parishioners were suffocating. Officially, this was explained by the need for ritual purity, but everyone understood that it was to hide the smell of decay, which neither embalmers nor incense could stop. The day after the funeral, the heir, the Empress's young son, was brought to the throne room, trembling, surrounded by his mother's advisors. He was proclaimed sovereign, but real power immediately passed into the hands of the Regency Council. This council, consisting of old courtiers and senior military commanders, began rewriting laws by the end of the first week, repealing many of the late Empress's decrees. Taxes introduced by her to finance the wars were abolished particularly quickly, bringing temporary relief to merchants and craftsmen. However, the changes turned into chaos. Her cousin, who was being held captive, managed to send messengers to allies in neighboring lands, promising them privileges in exchange for support in the struggle for the throne. Unrest broke out in the border areas. Peasants refused to pay taxes to the new government, arguing that they had been promised freedom under the previous regime. This provided fertile ground for uprisings which in some places escalated into open clashes with the garrisons. Rumors spread throughout the cities. Some claimed that the Empress was the victim of a conspiracy, others that she had slowly poisoned herself in an attempt to achieve immortality. Clergymen in different dioceses interpreted her death in their own way. Some saw it as an example of punishment for pride, others as the martyrdom of a righteous woman. Even the court chronicles gave different accounts. Some mentioned long exhaustion of the body from an unknown illness. Others, fatal weakness from excessive medical treatment. Abroad, the news of her death was met with relief. The ambassadors of some powers wrote directly to their rulers that now it is possible to conduct business without fear of sudden whims, so characteristic of the deceased. However, neighbors feared that the weakened power under a young ruler would give rise to military invasions. A month after the funeral, the Empress's body was secretly transferred to another crypt. Officially, this was explained by ritual requirements, but in reality, the reason was the rapid decomposition of the remains. Mercury poison that had soaked into the tissues accelerated the process, and even the stone sarcophagus could not contain the smell. In the popular imagination, her image was divided. For some, she remained a strict and unyielding ruler who was not afraid to stand up to her enemies. For others, she was a symbol of tyranny, arrogance, and blind faith in destructive means. Her name was whispered for a long time, and storytellers passed on tales of how, on her last nights, she saw ghosts who had come for her soul. But the main legacy of her death was that no one at court dared to use mercury as a remedy anymore. This metal, which had recently been considered almost sacred in medicine, was declared a cursed substance, and any use of it was punishable as an attempt on life. Thus, the personal tragedy of one ruler changed medical practice throughout the state, and with it, the balance of power, leaving the throne in the hands of those who had stood behind locked doors during the last days of her life.